Namaste, Sri Acharyaji. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Wonderful. Namaste. It's very good to see you as well.
As with the moots that we have in London, these are religious events, so I shall open with the first verse from Burluspal. Then there'll be 9 seconds or so of silence so we can clear extraneous thoughts and prepare for this evening's presentation. Then I'll say a few more words. I shall light a candle, then we will begin and I shall introduce the speaker. Right, so... Jag spigar alla själga kindir, mer jag minne, möger än alla. Heltkvällstidningar är något av nöft. Och vet bemakam lite sakens tidningar och jag vill se om de säker. Är alltid själva avsinniga hälsor i form av paret. Något man vet givet upp mer än 2 och liknelsen om det. Brandy brandningsbrunnin funnikväckesta funna mother of money börjar att malikuder inte dalska av dörr. Hail evening and the sons of evening, hail night and her daughter. Look with unangry eyes upon us sitting and grant us victory. Hail the gods, hail the goddesses, hail the bountiful earth. Grant us words, wisdom and healer's hands while we live. Flame is quickened by flame. A man from another man may become wiser, but from conceit may remain ignorant. Gods of our peoples and lands, may we spend this time together in friendship with you and with one another and use it to the common good with profit and with pleasure. Hello. The meeting is formally underway now, and I'll introduce our first speaker. If not, I'll just quickly outline some salient facts. Sri Dharma Pravartaka Acharya is a well-recognized spiritual teacher and author who's been intensely practicing the path of Sanatana Dharma for more than 4 decades. He counts among his numerous admirers Dr. Deepak Chopra, Shambhavi Chopra, Dr. David Frawley, the editorial staff of Hinduism Today, who has called him one of the top 3 authorities on Vedic spirituality in the world today, and many hundreds of other important spiritual leaders and teachers. He lived a life as a full-time Hindu monk from 1978 until 1986 and was initiated as a Hindu priest in India in 1986. He earned his PhD in religious studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's currently recognized as one of the world's foremost authorities on Hinduism, the yoga tradition, dharma, spirituality and meditation. Published a dozen authoritative books on Vedic spirituality. One of the few non-Indian spiritual teachers to be accepted by both the Orthodox Indian Hindu community in addition to the Western spiritual community. From July 2007 to July 2009, he served as the resident Acharya of the Hindu temple of Nebraska in Omaha, which represents the first time in history that an American has ever been appointed to such a highly prestigious post. He's the director of the Sanatana Dharma Society, which is a global spiritual movement with an excellent website, which I'd recommend. And there's a YouTube channel, Dharma Nation. And with that, Acharyaji, please, the floor is yours.
Very good. Wonderful. Well, first of all, let me say to everyone in the Sanskrit language, Namaste, which very simply means I offer my respects unto you. And let me thank you, first of all, very much for inviting me to this event, inviting me to give this lecture. I want to thank all of you for being here as well, given these trying times, of course, with COVID-19, as we were speaking about just a short time ago. It's nice that we have such opportunities to still get together, even if online, even if we can't be together face to face. But thank you all very much for being here and for listening to my talk. If you will please bear with me, I will give a talk for about 35 or so minutes, something like that. I then want to leave ample time to have questions and answers, etc. And let me just explain very briefly, thank you for that introduction. In addition to that, I also want to explain to people that for myself personally, I am an extremely orthodox, very traditionalist follower of what is called the Vedic tradition or Sanatana Dharma, what is properly called Sanatana Dharma. However, as individuals in the Asatru community who know me will attest, I am not only, in addition to that, extremely favorable toward Asatru, but I count among my personal students, actually, many leaders of Asatru throughout the world, including especially in America. One very important leader of whom I actually even gave initiation as well. And it's been very interesting to me that I've seen that over roughly the last maybe 6 or 7 years especially, even though my audience primarily is of course Vedic people, that is Hindus, individuals who practice yoga, Vedic spirituality, etc. I've seen that since the publishing of my one book specifically, the Dharma Manifesto, and there it is there, being held up, since that book came out, yes, very good, several people have it, I now apparently have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of Asatru followers who follow everything that I do, from the videos to the books to private conversations, online conversations and meetings that we have like this. And that is not by accident. I mean, at first, honestly, I was very happy, but at the same time a little bit surprised when that first began occurring, that Asatru people started connecting with me, contacting me, asking me questions, etc. But truthfully, it is not really surprising in any way. As I think you will see, if you don't already know this, I'm sure many of you already know this, but as you will see by the time this talk is over, Sanatana Dharma and Asatru, when it comes to, let's say, philosophy, not necessarily practice, because of course they are two different traditions with different histories, but when it comes to the philosophical and worldview foundations of both paths, they are the same. And I don't state that lightly. I'm not a New Age person. I'm not a person who believes in mixing and matching paths that do not belong together. In fact, I wrote an entire book about that called Radical Universalism. Religions are indeed different. But even with that being the case, what we will see is philosophically, followers of Asatru and followers of Sanatana Dharma are pretty much on the exact same page when it comes to the concept of natural law, when it comes to concepts of history and what I'm going to be talking about today specifically, and that is Dharmic, that is natural law, let's say culture versus Abrahamism. Especially when it comes to that, we are on the exact same page. Because unfortunately, for the last 4,000 years, which is really when Abrahamism came into being, for the last 4,000 years, both Sanatana Dharma and really all of the, let's say, pre-Abrahamic religions, including Asatru, including ancient Celtic, ancient Slavic, Greco-Roman religions, etc., we have been the victims of Abrahamism. They have attempted, and sadly, in some cases very successfully so, to annihilate us, to destroy us. But more on that later. Well, my only point in this little preface is saying that I feel very much at home here with Asatru people. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Good. So with that, again, just give me about 35 minutes or so, and I will discuss this topic of Abrahamism versus Dharma and what specifically these two worldviews are. Let me first of all start with what is of most importance, and that is, of course, Dharma itself. First of all, I want to define what indeed Dharma is. In fact, for that matter, the term Sanatana Dharma itself. This is a term that now I'm very happy to know is a term that's very well known. And let me explain to people who may not know this, that the term Sanatana Dharma was not well known at all 30 years ago. And I am the person who put it on the map. I made it a personal mission roughly in the late 80s or so to replace the term Hinduism with the term Sanatana Dharma. The reason why that was the case is because Hinduism is a made-up term. It was a term that was given to us by our enemies. It's not a term that is found in the Vedic scriptures in any way whatsoever. The term Hinduism is no more than approximately 350 years old, something like that. Rather, what our tradition, the Vedic tradition itself refers to itself as is this term, Sanatana Dharma. This is found in the Vedic scriptures going as far back as Rig Veda, which is extremely ancient, at least 5,000 years old. By my estimation, it's older than that, actually. More like 5,800 years ago is when it was first written down. So you find this term all throughout the tradition itself. Now, what does this term mean? Well, very simply, Sanatana means that which is eternal. That which is eternal. And what is eternal? Again, not in the Abrahamic sense, meaning something that is everlasting, something that will never cease to exist. See, that's the Abrahamic idea of eternal. Thus, for example, when the Abrahamic traditions talk about how we have an eternal soul, well, what they mean is we have a soul that will never die. However, did it come into being? Well, according to the Abrahamic tradition, yes. Not according to Sanatana Dharma. By the term Sanatana, or eternal, this is a two-way street. In other words, that which is truly eternal in the transcendent sense, not only will never cease to be, but it never came into being. It's truly eternal in both directions. Thus, this is what the word Sanatana means. Now, the word Dharma itself is a little bit more difficult to translate into the English language because there is no word-for-word equivalent. What I've translated it as is indeed natural law, or the natural way. That's a very easy way to understand it. However, what is really meant by Dharma, or natural law, is an idea that, again, is akin to the very same concept among all the ancients. And that is the idea that when we look at the universe around us, when we look at everything that is perceivable, that is conceivable, whether we're talking about the actual, let's say, principles and forces of nature, whether we're talking about greater forces in the cosmos, whether we're talking about human behavior, thus translated afterwards into human law, etc., etc. What we are talking about are inherent principles that are there found within the very structure of the cosmos itself. Thus, truly natural law, truly in every sense. Now, what's interesting is what all of the natural law traditions teach is something that really is quite simple to understand, not necessarily practice, but to understand. And that is that if we, as individuals, as families, as nations, as peoples, if we live in accordance with this natural law that we find inherent in nature itself, what do we have? We have everything that is auspicious. We have health, we have prosperity, we have joy, we have happiness, etc., because we are working in conjunction with, indeed, the laws of nature, which themselves are upheld by the gods and goddesses, etc. And then conversely, when we begin to veer away from these natural laws, which, again, I call Dharma, which is translated as natural law, when we begin to veer away from these laws, we have the opposite. We begin to have both ourselves as individuals, but then our families, nations, etc., begin to become morally corrupt, degenerate, unhealthy, etc., and to begin to express themselves in ways that are the opposite of the natural. Well, of course, not really knowing everyone here personally, but understanding that you are all followers of Asatru, I'm sure you can guess where society has gone now, today. Well, of course, we're not following natural law in any way whatsoever. At least societies are not, nations are not, individuals are. Thus, myself, I would certainly think everyone who is here, who is watching this, you yourselves are doing your best to try to follow Dharma or natural law, etc. So we still have many individuals who are trying to follow natural law. However, of course, what is missing today very specifically, and I've noted this several times, both in writing but also in several of my lectures, people may not be aware of this. But historically speaking, up until recently, there has never been a time upon the earth where you could look upon all the nations of the earth and say, right now, there's not one nation consciously following natural law. You could not say that until recently. No, roughly 20 years ago or so, something like that. The last nation maybe being the nation of Nepal, where they had a Acharyaji, they had a religious king who tried to rule in accordance with Dharma, but then he was overthrown quite literally by communists. Now there's not one nation that is being ruled in accordance with natural law or Dharma. There's never, ever in the history of the world been a time like this where you can't point to one nation following natural law. But that being said, I want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the ancient world and about, indeed, the universality of this idea of natural law. Again, when we look at all of the ancient cultures of the past, the pre-Abrahamic cultures, I mentioned many of the, let's say, cultural spheres of Europe. So again, Norse culture, Slavic, Greco-Roman, Celtic, etc. Whether we look at those cultures, whether we look at ancient Persia, not the Iran of today, but again, ancient Persia, pre-Islamic Persia, when they were following Zoroastrianism. Whether we're talking about, again, pre-Islamic Mesopotamia, Iraq, what today is called Iraq, and all these places. Whether we're looking at all of South Asia, what today is called Pakistan and India and all these places, extending all the way through Southeast Asia, all the way to the Philippines, etc., etc. Whether you even talk about nations that are not that were not necessarily under direct Indo-European influence, like ancient China, etc., ancient Japan. Still, interestingly, all of these nations tried to follow this concept of natural law, to the point where they all had their own words for it. Again, in Sanskrit it's called Dharma. In ancient Chinese, it was called Dao. That became translated in Korean and Japanese as Do. In ancient Persia, this was known as Asha. Asha, same concept, natural law. In ancient Egypt, this was known as Ma'at. Ma'at, following the natural way, the ways of nature. And I can go on and on. There are quite literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ancient terms for this very same concept. Thus, when we talk about the ancient pre-Abrahamic world, indeed, the vast majority of the world, whether we talk about the grand civilizations like the Greco-Romans or even smaller tribes, actually, at least on paper, tried to follow this concept, at least respected the concept of natural law. Of course, this was not true for all the ancients. There were peoples, indeed, who did not follow natural law, and they were considered to be demonic individuals. Thus, those individuals who did indeed follow the natural way, the ways of nature, Dharma, they were known in the ancient Sanskrit as Arya. Arya, the noble ones, the noble people. But then there were always those individuals who rebelled against the natural way, and they were called Anarya, Anarya. So the opposite, ignoble. These were individuals who were not noble in any way. Now, having said that, just as a very brief preface, what I'm going to be doing now is basically giving several lists of very important characteristics, traits, elements, etc., to both explain what is the Dharmic worldview from a very practical perspective, but then afterwards, what is Abrahamism? I'm going to compare and contrast them. And then at that point, I think I will open things up for questions and answers. So several things. First of all, several civilizational principles of Dharmic culture. And again, you can go back 5,000 years, and these were ethical principles, these were behavioral principles, etc., that you would find in any civilization that tried to follow natural law. And you'll, as followers of Asatru, you will recognize many of these principles yourselves. In fact, interestingly, for those individuals who are not even necessarily spiritual, but let's say, to state it politically, somewhat conservative or traditionalist, even many individuals like this will recognize many of these principles as principles that they themselves uphold. So, these are some of the civilizational principles of Dharmic culture. First, the centrality of work, of family, and of education. Again, this is something that we find universally. Next, being honorable, respectful, loyal, earnest, and supremely noble in all of one's personal behavior. Next, striving always for excellence in all things. This is another aspect, interestingly, of not just Vedic, but again, all Dharmic cultures or natural law cultures, is that what we find is that there are always individuals who very bravely strive for excellence in all things, regardless of what their field is, whether they're scholars, whether they're warriors, etc., artists. Our people strive for excellence. Good enough, in other words, is never good enough. Rather, we seek perfection, even materially, as a reflection of that transcendent perfection in everything that we do. So this is another quality. I'm going to be skipping several of these things because, honestly, the research that I've done on this has fit several volumes, some of which are almost 500 pages long that I've written. Just talking about the comparisons of all these ancient, again, Dharmic cultures throughout the world, stretching from Ireland to the Philippines. This alone we could talk about probably for 10 hours alone, so I'll be skipping several of these, but just a few more that I want to talk about. The cultivation of discursive and discriminative thought, logical reasoning, study, learning, and scholarship. Thus, what we have seen is that natural law civilizations tend to be civilizations of thinkers, of individuals who are extremely intelligent and more who cultivate the science of logic and reasoning, etc. Thus, this is why we've had so many scientific breakthroughs throughout the history of Europe, etc. All right, now that aside, this especially I think people are going to find very, very interesting. I want to talk about some pan-Dharmic civilizational elements. And what I mean by this is, you can, as I'm going through this list, in your minds, think of any of the ancient, again, pre-Abrahamic civilizations, whether ancient Greece, whether Troy, whether Rome, whether anything we can think of, again, Persia, India, etc., etc. And what you will see is that these are civilizational elements that they all share in common. And some of these are quite interesting. The first of these is the idea of having small, manageable cities and or city-states. Now, interestingly, the Vedic scriptures themselves talk about how cities are a good thing when they are properly managed. It's in cities that culture can thrive, that you can have economic prosperity, etc., etc. You can have diverse people with different ideas coming together, having discussions, etc., etc. However, the Vedic scriptures also make it very clear that cities must remain small, otherwise they become degenerate. So interestingly, the maximal number of individuals who should populate a city in accordance with the Vedic scriptures is 50,000. There should be no more than 50,000 people in a city. Now, for myself, I come from New York City, where the population is 7 million. And that's small compared to some other places. So, for example, Mexico City, I forget what the population is. I believe it's something like 20 million or something like that. It's astronomical. It's amazing. And we can just imagine where the Vedic scriptures are telling us a city should have no more than 50,000 people, otherwise it begins to become degenerate. Well, we can look at many of the major cities of this world and see just how wise that was. Another important element is the idea of theocratic governments, that is, the religion and state being united. You know, with many of these ancient city-states, what we have seen is that, actually not many of them, all of them, they are structured in a very similar sort of way, whether we're talking about the cities of, again, ancient Egypt, the Greeks, India, etc., etc. That is, what is at the center of the city? What is at the center of the city, both conceptually, spiritually, but also quite literally, geographically, as far as an actual architectural structure? What is at the very center of the city is the temple. You have a temple, a ziggurat, etc., whatever you wish to call it, that is at the center of the city. There is a primary deity who is there within the temple, who is the deity of the people of that city or that city-state nation, etc. And more than this, the king is often the chief priest. This is not always the case, but it's usually the case, that the king, the secular ruler of the city-state of the nation, also serves as the chief priest. And more, that king is reigning, one could say, in representation of the deity. In other words, it is the deity who actually is considered to be the king. But the actual physical king is simply reigning, representing the actual deity. Several other things to be said about this. As far as the king, as far as the ruler, what we have in the ancient world is the idea of divine kingship. That is the idea that the king, to use the Sanskrit, is not just an ordinary person, but is considered to be a Chakravartin. Now, what is a Chakravartin? This is, of course, Sanskrit. The idea of a Chakravartin is not just a king, but a perfect king. And what that means in turn is several things. An individual who is, as I said, ruling on behalf of God or goddess. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the qualities of that king, of that ruler, is very special. What they represent is the coming together perfectly of two seemingly disparate qualities that actually come together perfectly in the personage of that king. And that is, on the one hand, the martial element, but then on the other hand, the spiritual or the priestly element. Now, what we have seen historically is that you either are one or the other. Usually if you're a warrior, you're not a priest. If you're a priest, you are not a warrior. Well, with the perfect ruler, with this Chakravartin concept, that person is indeed both. That person is an individual who is highly spiritual, who in fact has the ability to teach spiritual truths, but at the same time, they can also pick up a sword and lead their army in battle. And they can be a perfect king, a perfect administrator. This is the idea of the Chakravartin. And again, this is a universal concept in the past. We found this, for example, with Plato in the Republic. He talks about the philosopher king. And we find this with the idea of King Arthur as well. Speaking to individuals in the UK, of course you know this, that King Arthur himself was in actuality what in Sanskrit we would call a Chakravartin. That is, he was the perfect king. He was an individual who, and this is the third element of what makes up a Chakravartin, a true ruler is one with his people and with the soil. Indeed, that perfect ruler is a manifestation of his people and of the soil, of his nation. When you're looking at not just a ruler, not just a king, but this concept of the Chakravartin. And let me tell you what Chakravartin means. It means one who holds in his hand the chakra of Dharma. In other words, a person who literally is holding in his hand the power of Dharma. That's what a Chakravartin means. So this perfect king is an individual who is, one could say, a manifestation of the true will of the people, of his people, and of the nation. So that's what a Chakravartin is. Let's go on a little bit more. And again, truthfully, I can go on with a list of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of elements like this, talking about all these let's say, pan-Dharmic civilizational elements. But I'm just going to limit myself to a few because I ultimately also want to talk about Abrahamism and what is the contrast between these two extremely opposing worldviews. One other thing is the natural hierarchy of being. The natural hierarchy of being. You know, it's funny, I've been wanting to write a book for decades now, and I haven't had a chance to get around to it. But I have the title. I even have an outline, actually. But I have the title of this book, and it's called The Dirtiest Word, a study in the nature of hierarchy. Hierarchy, of course, has become the dirtiest of words today, to the point where we know that, again, this is true both for Abrahamism. The idea of rebelling against the concept of hierarchy did indeed spring from Abrahamism, but now very much Marxism as well. This idea of radical egalitarianism, where rather than understanding this natural qualitative hierarchy of being, where every single thing in existence, and again, both perceptually, that is, existent objects, but also conceptually, ideas, concepts, etc., everything falls within a certain spectrum in accordance with its quality. And that highest of qualities being highest because it is closest to the very nature of transcendence itself, and that which is lowest being lowest because it is furthest away from that same transcendence. This idea of, again, this natural hierarchy of being is something that is universal in all natural law, religions, civilizations, cultures, etc. And it was understood that this was the only way, the only logical and rational way to understand the nature of reality, including human beings, including humans. And, that is especially, of course, anathema today, as we know. We cannot judge human beings in accordance with their internal qualities. Human beings, indeed, according to Marxism, human beings don't have internal qualities whatsoever. Thus, the modernist worldview is absolutely in every way opposed to this idea of natural hierarchy. But this is yet another of these very important concepts. Now, continuing as a subset, let's say, of hierarchy, of this natural hierarchy of being, we also have this other very important, let's say, a social organizational concept that we find among all the ancients. And that is the idea of psychophysical natures of human beings and the resultant classes that come about as a result of this. So at the sheer minimum, we know that all of the ancients who followed natural law believed that there were at least 3 classes of people. And this varied a little bit in accordance with the various cultures that you looked at. But generally speaking, you could say that the ancients recognized that there was the class of, let's say, priestly scholars, individuals who were wise people, who led society spiritually. That was the first class. The second class was the class of warriors/administrators. Again, kings, actual warriors who just spent all their time on the battlefield, individuals who were managers, administrators of state, etc. The third class being everyone else, or not quite everyone else, but let's say laborers/farmers. Now, interestingly, in the Vedic scriptures, rather than this tripartite sort of system, there are 4 classes that are recognized. There are what are called the Brahmanas, that is the, again, intellectual priestly class, the scholars, the individuals who served as judges, etc., etc. Then there were the Kshatriyas, there were the warriors/administrators, politicians, one could say rulers. Then there were the Vaishyas. These were the farmers/merchants. This was the capitalist class, one could say, of business people. And then finally there were the Shudras, and those were the laborers. Those were the 4 classes. Now, interestingly, also in most of these ancient cultures, you also had, one could say, a 5th group. You can't call them a class, but you also had one additional group, and those were the Untouchables. Those were the outsiders. Those were, again, the Anarya, the, let's say, ignoble individuals, people who were not noble, and they were not even a part of the system. Now, again, you find this basic class structure among all the ancients, and in Europe, actually, continuing all the way into the Middle Ages, up until the Industrial Era. where you had the priests, you had the knightly class, and then you had the peasants. So you had this tripartite sort of class structure. So again, this was something that was universal, absolutely universal. Now again, I'm just looking at the time, and you're just going to have to believe me when I tell you this. I have a list of many more elements like this, which I think people are finding interesting, and maybe some people would like me to go on, but I know I only have an hour, so I want to not go too deeply into more aspects of Dharma. Rather, I want to talk a little bit about Abrahamism now. And in order to do that, I need, in fact, to contrast the Abrahamic worldview from the Dharmic worldview at the most fundamental level. And that is in this way. What is, one could ask, what is, let's say, one of the philosophical foundations of the idea of natural law and of Dharma? Well, it's the idea of harmony. It's the idea of natural harmony. And what I'm talking about is the idea of taking disparate elements of nature as we find it around us and reconciling them in such a way that we are expressing nature perfectly and progressively in such a manner that we ourselves can grow individually, but also as a society. So this is what I mean by harmony. So thus, for example, just to give an example, what I was talking about just a moment ago, how we have these various classes in human society. We have some people who, they are scholars. That's their inherent nature. That's what they want to be. Then we have some people who are warriors, very ferocious. Then we have other individuals who are very businesslike and they just think about money all the time. Then we have some individuals who don't think. They don't really engage in discursive reasoning. Rather, they love to work with their hands. These are what are considered to be laborers, shudras, etc. Now, recognizing these natural differences that are there among human beings, what Dharma does is indeed tries to reconcile them in a harmonious way such that all these classes can work together for the greater good of the people and the nation. That's Dharma. Now, on the other hand, we have Abrahamism. Abrahamism is based upon the very opposite sort of idea, and that is the idea that conflict is something that should be encouraged as much as possible. What I have called conflict theory. Again, if you read the Dharma Manifesto, I go much more deeply than I can in this very brief talk. But with Abrahamism, the idea is the very opposite of Dharma. The idea is that, no, conflict is good. Thus, when you see classes, have them war with each other. Have them war with each other. It's essentially the Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The idea that, oh, you have two opposing elements, have them clash. And then with the idea, mistaken, of course, philosophically and empirically mistaken, historically we've seen very mistaken, with the idea that when you have a violent clash, something better will come about. Thus, we have class struggle, as we see in Marxism. And Marxism, again, I don't have time to go into this, but please read the Dharma Manifesto. You'll see that Marxism is 100% Abrahamic. Its very philosophical foundation is Abrahamic due to many reasons, including this reason that I'm mentioning philosophically. That the idea is quite literally the opposite of Dharma, that wherever you see distinctions, you have to accentuate. Accentuate with the idea of there being warfare, and thus bringing about some mythical, eschatological idea of a perfect socialist paradise. All right? So, let me look at some of these, indeed, distinctions. How is Dharma different from the Abrahamic religions? And again, those of you who have read my books, you've heard many of these before, but for those of you who haven't, hopefully this will be very enlightening. So first of all, Dharma is pro nature. Well, that's a given. In every way. We are pro-nature. We love nature. As individuals, we love being in nature. Nature is like our temple. You know, for myself, whenever I go out into nature, that's like being in a temple. And I can be in nature for hours, just walking and breathing and soaking in all of the energies of the living beings who are around me. We are very much pro-nature. Abrahamism, on the other hand, is at war with nature. And we've seen this. We've seen this both theologically, Abrahamists, and we know this from, of course, when Christian missionaries especially began going into the deeper parts of Europe, going into Germania, etc., into the UK, what was, the UK back then, they were at war with nature. They saw nature as suspicious. It was in nature that devils dwelt. And they would find these holy places, these holy natural temples of the indigenous European peoples, and they would destroy them. They would destroy sacred trees and sacred groves, etc., because, again, the Abrahamists saw nature as the devil. So they are very much anti-nature. For the Dharmic spirituality, divinity is expressed both in masculine and feminine terms. As we know, we believe in both gods and goddesses. In fact, for that matter, for those of us who are more monotheistically oriented, so for myself, honestly, I am more monotheistically oriented, meaning that, I believe in the gods and goddesses very much. I believe in nature spirits, etc., etc., But I also believe that ultimately there is one supreme absolute, one transcendent absolute. Very much akin to what Plato and Plotinus would say, that ultimately there is the one who is above all things. But as a follower of Sanatana Dharma, we believe that that one, that if you wish to call it God, has both masculine and feminine attributes. So this is something that we find actually all throughout the ancient pre-Abrahamic world. For the Abrahamic religions, on the other hand, this divinity is exclusively masculine. There is no place for the feminine. There is no Sophia. There is no idea of the goddess anywhere within Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Compassion versus justice. The Dharmic religions believe in compassion. This is why very often in the ancient literature you will hear about compassion all the time. Compassion that is integrated also with the idea of justice. Of course, there must always be justice, but with the Abrahamic religions, on the other hand, what we have seen in a very practical sort of way is that the Abrahamic religions, and especially Judaism and Islam, tend to be law-based. That is, you follow the law, otherwise you are punished, and there's very little room for compassion. So, in the Dharmic cultures, beauty is revered. Beauty is something that is seen as a manifestation of the divine. Thus, whenever we see beauty, especially natural beauty, whether it's in human beings, whether it's in animals, whether it's in nature, whether it's in all of the various arts, whether it's sculpture, painting, music, etc., we love and practically worship beauty because, again, we see beauty as a pathway for knowing the divine. For the Abrahamic religions, on the other hand, again, just like with nature, they are suspicious of beauty. If a woman is too beautiful, she must be covered up. We must throw a veil upon her. In many of these Abrahamic cultures, you are not allowed to depict human beings. You are not allowed to depict nature in art, etc., etc. The architecture tends to be very, very, very austere. Especially if you're a Christian and you come from the Calvinist tradition, you're barely allowed to even have a cross in your church, what to speak of depictions of beauty in any way. The Dharmic religions tend to be rational, tend to be indeed very philosophical, whereas the Abrahamic religions tend to be very emotional. They tend to be very emotionally based. Now, of course, an individual who is a, let's say, somewhat more educated follower of one of the Abrahamic religions might try to protest and say, what are you talking about? Have you not heard of Thomas Aquinas? Have you not heard of all these Christian philosophers, Islamic philosophers, etc., etc.? And of course, how do we counter this? Well, very easily. All you need to do is look at the history of so-called Christian and Islamic philosophy, and you realize that 100% of it ultimately finds its source origin in pagan philosophy. It finds its source origin in Aristotelianism and Platonism, among other things. So thus, even so-called Christian philosophy and so-called Islamic philosophy borrowed extensively, if not completely, from pre-Abrahamic philosophical traditions. Truthfully, those pagan sources taken away from Christian and Islamic so-called philosophy, there would be no philosophy in Christianity or Islam. So the Dharmic religions tend to be philosophical. Indeed, we are the very source of philosophy itself. Thus, you have these ancient philosophical traditions, again, all throughout the Greco-Roman system, ancient Chinese, ancient Indian, etc. Whereas for the Abrahamic traditions, there is no philosophy that's there, especially if you read the Old Testament and the Quran. Can I just end in this way before I take questions, actually? And that is this, just to reiterate that, again, even though I consider myself to be primarily a follower of Sanatana Dharma, of the Vedic tradition, again, the not only respect that I have for Asatru is tremendous and great. Not just respect, but indeed, it is indeed my great hope that Asatru, that Norse spirituality, can be fully revived as much as is possible, given the fact that, of course, much of the literature and traditions are gone. And I know, firsthand many of the individuals who are very bravely trying to reconstruct Asatru and the ancient Norse religion. I just want to say, not only do you have my full support in this, but in fact, unbeknownst to many people, other than just a tiny number of people, I have been helping indeed to reconstruct Asatru among the Asatru community. Again, very few people know this, just some of the leaders, in revealing sadhanas, revealing actual spiritual practices. And for example, in 2014, I revealed what is quite literally in Sanskrit a Thor mantra, a brief mantra, and then a Thor Gayatri mantra that very few people know because I have not taught it publicly. I've only initiated a tiny number of people in these two Thor mantras. So again, Asatru is a path that I consider to be a sister path to Sanatana Dharma, and that gives you some indication of how much that is indeed the case. So with that, for the few minutes we have left, any questions or comments?
First, I'd like to thank you profoundly for such a stimulating talk. And secondly, perhaps it'd be possible for you to come back in the future, because I think there will not be time for all those who wish to ask a question to do so. Would that be possible, Acharyaji?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be wonderful, particularly as you do have this relationship with Asatru. That is going to be a great benefit. So I'm very, very, very pleased to hear that. May I just ask a question which several people have put to me, to ask you, and I think a lot of them are not here, so that may be a good thing to do. Several people have asked why you were drawn to what's called Hinduism as opposed to a tradition that had its roots in Europe.
Sure, definitely. Well, part of it is the historical context in which I began my spiritual journey. I first began following Sanatana Dharma when I was 10 years old. So we're talking about 1973. And I was living in New York. I was, and still am, of Italian heritage. Resources were limited. So there was zero knowledge. There was no internet. There was zero knowledge of Asatru back then, other than among a small number of people. I mean, if anything, interestingly, the more I learned about the ancient pre-Christian European religions, actually, interestingly, the more solidified I was in my decision, because again, I saw them as the same, just different cultural expressions. But philosophically, again, this short list that I gave, I could have gone on for another 5 hours describing the similarities, and I think pretty much everyone who is a follower of Asatru would agree with everything that was said here. Philosophically, the foundations of Sanatana Dharma and Asatru are the same. If anything, and I don't mean this to be controversial, it's just a fact. I mean, anyone, again, I know many leaders of Asatru, and they all agree with this. The truth is that Sanatana Dharma is an intact tradition. It has a literature, not just a literature, it has a literature consisting of hundreds and hundreds of sacred texts, all of which are intact. The traditions are intact. The practices are intact. We know exactly what to do to bring ourselves closer to the divine, meditation practices, ritual practices, etc. There's nothing that is missing. Versus the European religions, due to persecution, of course, we know that priests burnt sacred texts. They killed pagan priests, etc., etc. Thus, much of the knowledge is lost. So this is another reason why I follow Sanatana Dharma. It's all there. It's all intact. And in fact, so much so that, again, I'm sure you yourself and many people in Asatru know this. Many Asatru leaders and scholars indeed turn to the Vedic tradition to fill in the blanks. And in fact, I've encouraged them to do that for decades. I've actually told Asatru people, please don't feel like you're stealing from Sanatana Dharma in any way. No, we're sister religions. In any way that we can help you to understand your own tradition better, it's our humble honor to do so. So, yeah, that's why I found myself more drawn to Sanatana Dharma.
Yes, indeed. I have a couple of questions in the chat, but I think it would be good to give someone the opportunity to speak or to put it. Michael, you've got your hand up first, so go ahead,
right.
sir.
Let me just say, I really enjoyed your talk, and I think basically I think we all would agree with how you have synchronized or aligned or harmonized Dharmic understandings with, let's say, heathen understandings. The only a couple little things I want to question. I would question the idea of the centrality of work and family not also being part of the Abrahamic, especially when you think of both the Jewish tradition and the Calvinist tradition from which we get our capitalism. Work was always stressed, and the family seems to be always central. And just a couple other little things that I might question you on would be, for instance, Spinoza believes that this class struggle should be eliminated for going for a greater harmony. But Nietzsche comes out and says that class struggle is what makes us stronger. So he sees it as a positive. And at the same time, Nietzsche was totally opposed to the idea of compassion. So, I mean, he's a complicated one. But, and then just on the rational emotional thing, very often rationality is ascribed more to the Abrahamic and the Western tradition which comes out of that, as opposed to heathenism, paganism, which refine and re-exalt emotionality. So that's just, we could probably debate this for another occasion.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, let me just say several things. Yes, this is what's interesting, is that there's always room for nuance. So, of course, what we see is that there are, well, let me back up. We are indeed talking about natural law. This being the case, it is certainly the case that you will find certain natural law principles that are followed even by people in the Abrahamic traditions, despite themselves. Despite themselves, because truthfully, you cannot even survive as a people unless you follow these natural law principles. Thus, of course, yes, when it comes to the idea of work, family, education, yes, you find that being very strong today, especially among many Abrahamists as well, like you mentioned, the Calvinists, etc., the Protestant work ethic, etc. So yes, there is certainly a little bit of crossover. As far as Spinoza, Spinoza was a very interesting individual. He was a pantheist, and that being the case, one could argue that he himself, even though of course he was born of Jewish origins, thus technically an Abrahamist. It's debatable how much of an Abrahamist he was. His ideas...
He was expelled from his community.
Yeah, exactly. And then as far as Nietzsche, let me tell you, and I don't mean to be blasphemous here, because I know a lot of people who love Nietzsche and who are even Nietzscheans and take a lot of inspiration from Nietzsche. Let me tell you point blank, I'm not one of them. I don't like Nietzsche. And I have studied philosophy very extensively. I essentially have, my PhD work was in philosophy of religion, and I've studied philosophy academically. I did that for 10 years. I don't like Nietzsche. I don't even consider him to be a philosopher in any way. And yet, that is why he's a very confused individual, and you can get anything from him, both good and bad, and again, all very confused. And I forget the last point that you made. Can you just remind me of that?
The rationality and emotionality.
Yes, yes, it's quite true. Again, there is crossover. These are not black and white. It's not the fact that, Abrahamism is 100% emotional, pre-Christian European religion is 100% rational. No, certainly there are elements in both. But again, I would argue that the rational elements that you find in the Abrahamic traditions are more recent accretions. When I say recent, I mean the last 1,200 years. But when you look at the scriptural foundations, there is not a lot of what we would consider philosophy per se. That is the idea of metaphysics, ontology, ethics described in a philosophical sense, etc., etc., but rather a lot that is based upon blind faith. This is true for the Old Testament. This is true for the Quran especially. There's nothing of any real philosophical content that is there in what is recognized as actual philosophy. But then ultimately, it's true that even when speaking about, let's say, the non-Abrahamic religions, when I said that these religions tend to be more philosophically, rationally oriented than the Abrahamic, not to the exclusion, however, of the mystical, and not to the exclusion of experiential insight. Indeed, if anything, the idea of many of the ancient philosophers, this was true especially for Plato, but quite a few of them, Plotinus, Socrates, is the idea that philosophical rational insight is meant to lead ultimately to experiential insight. That is an actual connection and communing with the absolute, with that which is transcendence. So while it's true that philosophy is something that has been of extreme importance, again, to all the natural law cultures, not to the exclusion of mystical insight and experience. So again, yes, there is some nuance that is there. And again, necessarily there has to be, because even with the Abrahamic religions, as much as they have been at war with the Dharmic cultures since the very beginning of their existence 4,000 years ago, with the coming onto the world scene of Abraham, there is necessarily going to be some crossover, because even those individuals who are at war with natural law themselves have to follow natural law to some limited degree just in order to live, just in order to exist and to continue as a people. So there will always be a little bit of crossover. So yes, very valid points, and thank you for making those points.
Thank you very much. Mick, did you have your hand up, or were you just eating? Sorry. Peter, did you have your hand up? Yeah, please.
Yeah, it was extremely interesting, and thanks for your speech and for attending.
My pleasure.
The question I had really were in terms of the Abrahamic religions. The issue seems to be that they're effectively utopian, and there's also this idea of either a chosen people or a chosen a religion which will dominate, and that will bring the end times effectively. And in terms of this, is there, in respect to Hinduism, is there this idea either of the end times of a utopia or a scatological end reality, or an idea effectively of heaven and of this dynamic, and also in terms of domination of Hinduism, or of that faith complex actually expanding and evangelizing and dominating. Is there this sort of will to power, as it were, in Hinduism as in the Abrahamic religions? I hope that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense, yes. It's a very good question, and I will try to answer this accurately yet briefly. Abrahamism is indeed, it tends to be extremely utopian in the worst sense of that term, of course, meaning the idea of creating some sort of perfect world that has never been witnessed before in history. You see, that's what utopianism in the worst sense of that term actually means. And yes, this is why Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and interestingly Marxism all share this feature in common. And they share many features, but talking about this specifically, they share this feature in common. That is the idea, the promise that they ultimately want to bring about a perfect world in the future. It's always in the future, A. B, it's always something that has never been witnessed historically, has never existed upon the earth. C, it is always a promise that is pushed further and further into the future due to, let's say, the smaller, more dependent promises never coming to fruition, etc. So yes, this is indeed one of the aspects of Abrahamism. Now, talking about the Vedic tradition, let me first of all say this very general statement, but then I'll go a little bit in depth. Interestingly, the Vedic tradition tends to do this, but in reverse. So in other words, and this also makes it a superior and a real utopianism, as opposed to a pie-in-the-sky utopianism. Rather than talking about a future coming into being of a state of reality that no one has ever witnessed, what the Vedic, and in fact, not just the Vedic, actually. Again, this is a common element among all the ancients. The Greco-Romans and on, I can give the whole list of all these ancient peoples. They would agree with this. There was at one time in the past a golden age that we have descended from, that we have fallen down from. That has been a progressive, let's say, falling away from this perfect state where historically, and this is the thing, again, it's not pie in the sky, but rather in all of the ancient literatures, all the peoples talk about how at one time historically upon the earth there was a golden age. And what does that mean? Everything was ruled in accordance with Dharma. Everything was ruled in accordance with natural law, and you had perfect leaders, and the people lived in harmony and abundance and prosperity, etc., etc. And I can go on, again, give a very, very long list of what a golden age looks like. And the idea is that we have little by little fallen away from that to the point where we are now in, indeed, the Kali Yuga. And it's very heartening to me that so many people, let's say now again talking politically, on the political right, have taken this very term itself, starting with René Guignon, Julius Evola, etc., this term Kali Yuga, which of course is a Vedic term. We are indeed now living in the Kali Yuga, which is the worst of all ages. However, as far as any, let's say, semi-eschatological sort of idea within the Vedic tradition, it is the idea that even within the Kali Yuga, we will see mini golden ages. So in other words, the downward progression of our age is not literally just in a one sort of motion sort of way. Rather, it's downward, but in a little golden age, and then downward more, and then a little golden age, and then downward more. So that's the first idea. The other idea, of course, is that we believe, and again, all the ancients did, that history progresses in a cyclical manner and not a linear manner. So all the Abrahamists, of course, they believe in linear history. They believe that there is an end point, a zenith in the future in history that we are all hurtling toward. And that's not the ancient idea. The ancient idea is that, no, we go through these cycles, and specifically 4 ages. And right now we're in the worst. But even within this bad age, we'll have mini golden ages, but ultimately there will be a true golden age again. But then again, regression, and then a true golden age, and this goes on for a certain determinate amount of time. So this is the idea that, yes, there is a mini golden age that is about to happen. In fact, I've taught people that we're in the very, very, very beginning of it. And this mini golden age is going to last for approximately 10,000 years. The Vedic scriptures talk about this within the scope of the Kali Yuga, which lasts for over 400,000 years. So that's the first part. The second part of what you were asking, as far as, I forget exactly how you stated it, but the idea, let's say, of for lack of a better term, let's say Vedic supremacism or something like this. Again, the idea actually is that at one time the entire earth was united in Dharma. There was no need for, let's say, an ascendant sort of will to power and the idea of Vedic tradition taking over the world. No, we had the world at one time. The totality of the world, except for those places, those few places that were barbaric. And there were always barbaric places, always. But the majority of the world indeed followed natural law at one time. Now, of course, due to this onslaught of Abrahamism that has waged war against the natural way, against Dharma for 4,000 years, now that world has shrunken and shrunken and shrunken to the point where, like I said initially, there are no Dharma nations anymore. There are no nations anywhere in existence except for, let's say, the provisional government of Tibet, which is not a ruling government. Otherwise, there are no natural law governments. We have lost a lot. But what is the hope? The hope is that, again, we will indeed see a restoration of Dharma in our lifetime.
Thank you. Yeah,
okay, you mentioned Tao, the concept of Tao in East Asia as the equivalent to Dharma or Ma. As you're probably aware, there's another major competing philosophical tradition over there, which is Confucianism. Would you not characterize Confucianism as well as a natural law belief system?
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. In fact, interestingly, this is something that is interesting historically, that of course we've seen this in Europe, we've seen this in India, we've seen this in so many places, where you can have, let's say, varying schools of thought all within a natural law context, within a Dharmic context. So this is the case for China as well. Interestingly, even Confucius himself uses the word Tao and uses it in the exact same way that is used in the Tao Te Ching. So yes, they both are natural law traditions, the only difference being that, of course, the way that the Tao or Dharma or natural law is expressed in, let's say, Taoism itself is a little bit more direct, is a little bit more, one could say, mystical, for lack of a better word, experiential, etc. Whereas the way that it's expressed in Confucianism is much more practical, much more politically, socially, behaviorally, ethically, etc. And in fact, interestingly, I wrote a paper about this, so maybe 25 years ago when I was in college, talking about how actually Taoism and Confucianism are perfect complements of one another for that reason. And indeed, historically in China, there were many people who in fact tried to merge the two, and quite successfully so, with the idea that Dharma is expressed in a spectrum. Again, from the most mystical, experiential to the most practical. Literally, how do you run a state? And what are the ethical, behavioral principles that people should uphold in social conduct, etc. So yes, that is the nature of Dharma, that it covers everything. So that's why, personally, I don't see any sort of serious conflict between Taoism and Confucianism. They both are upholding the Tao, or Dharma.
Do we have time for one more question, Acharyaji?
Sure, definitely.
I think Louise was... Louise, are you there?
Oh, hello, yes, I am.
Yeah. Please go ahead with your question.
Well, I was wanting to ask how Jesus and the Bible and Christianity all fits in with this. Was the Bible a made-up book, or what does he think?
Okay. Excellent question. And in fact, this is a very deep and complex question. So much so that, I'll answer this, but this will definitely have to be the last question, because this will take a little bit of time, because it's a very interesting thing. Again, to understand this fully, truly fully, please, when you have a chance, get two of my books specifically. First of all, the Dharma Manifesto, but also a much bigger book called Sanatana Dharma, The Eternal Natural Way. And in those two books, I go much deeper into this. And that is this. Yes, I've talked repeatedly about the Abrahamic religions And I understand that for many individuals who follow Asatru, this is kind of a blanket category. For myself, however, I take a nuanced approach when it comes to the personality and teachings of Jesus specifically. You see, and it's not just myself actually, many individuals who are not Christian in any way, and I'm not Christian at all by any means. At the same time, when we look at the teachings of Jesus specifically, we see a fellow Dharmi, a fellow, let's say, individual who followed Dharma. In fact, so much so that I consider Jesus to be a Dharma master. And in fact, most of the gurus, acharyas, etc. in the Vedic tradition who know about Jesus also consider him to be the same way. As far as we're concerned, Jesus was an individual who historically we have seen by his actions, by his words, was, as much as was safe, and ultimately wasn't because they killed him, he was at war with Abrahamism. He was an individual who stood out in his culture. I mean, obviously, he was in an Abrahamist culture, the only Abrahamist culture that existed at his time, which was Judaism. There was no later Christianity or Islam. But he stood out to the point where, as we know, the leaders of Judaism considered him to be an enemy. They considered him to be someone who was a blasphemer, someone who was not following the ways of the Old Testament, etc., etc. And I consider him to be an individual who was doing his best to teach Dharma in a very dangerous Abrahamist context. So dangerous to the point where, in fact, however careful he tried to be, they ultimately did torture and murder him. But again, when you look at his actual teachings, they are very much akin to teachings that you would find, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita. So we have to make this distinction between, on the one hand, Jesus, the person and the teacher, versus the monstrosity that came about organizationally after he left this world, and very soon after he left this world. This is why, again, in both of the books that I mentioned, I make a distinction between, let's say, the actual teachings of Jesus versus Pauline Christianity, that is, the teachings of Paul, who himself arguably was still very much an Abrahamist and kind of grafted Abrahamism onto the teachings of Jesus. Thus, what we see historically is we see really two traditions when we look at Christianity. On the one hand, yes, the majority of it was indeed Abrahamist, especially the institutional expression of Christianity. The missionaries going out of their way to persecute people and burning people at the stake and and just this reliance on Old Testament intolerance. This is what we find to be the vast majority of Christianity. However, what we also see is this minority expression of Christianity where we have seen historically this thread that has been there of a more, let's say, mystical expression of the actual teachings of Jesus. Thus, you have individuals throughout history, the various mystics, like the Desert Fathers or individuals like St. Francis, etc., who truly did try to live authentically spiritual lives to the point where they themselves were often persecuted by the official church. And as far as I'm concerned, again, Jesus himself was a Dharma master. Christianity, on the other hand, became an institutionalized, let's say, expression of Abrahamism in the name of Jesus that led to the very opposite of what Jesus taught. So this is why when we talk about how Christianity has been an enemy of paganism, heathenism, Dharma, etc., that is indeed the case institutionally. When it comes to Jesus the person, on the other hand, again, if you actually read his teachings, they're quite good. They're quite good. They're very much akin to what we find in Bhagavad Gita and other places.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. I know you have to go now. Do you have time for me to formally close the meeting, or do you have to rush off right
Absolutely.
now?
No, I have a few minutes. Yeah, I mean, again,
Okay.
I should
Okay,
even have 4 minutes.
I'm sorry for those who have questions that there's not time for, but I hope Acharyaji will come back again at a future moods. I hope that's possible and we can arrange that.
It would be my pleasure.
Apart from that, I would like to say two things. Dhanyavad and Vishva Dharma Ki Jai. Victory to the Universal Dharma.
Victory.
Now, I will now close the meeting and I should blow out the candle, and then perhaps people can chat a little bit before we formally close. Now, Amotugur amiskun same azir at kweldi skaldaglefa ono ebrender maki roinde moi egeviner ise ibekemur öl etrukit og at not skal kweld lefa. Sigur either, sigur os, either os. Blessed gods of our peoples and lands, at evening shall one praise the day, and at night shall one praise the evening. We offer thanks for what we profited by and for what we have found pleasure in. Punvanto Vishwam Arya, Gura Gurf Gavarulina Skulum, let us make the world noble. Hail Odin. Thank you again, Acharyaji, for coming. Thank you everyone for participating.